Imagine yourself under a starry sky, around the warm glow of a sacred fire, where speakers gather to share their wisdom and insights. Creating a sacred space where all are welcome to warm their hands. Here are your hosts, Sarenth, Odinson, Snow, Cabra, and Emily Streaking Fate. Discuss spirituality, mythology, animism, and culture around a virtual sacred fire. Won't you join us around Grandfather Fire?
Hail to fire and ice. Hail to our gods of changing seasons. Sumar and Vetter, of fall, spring, autumn, and winter, and the in-between. Hail to our ancestors who navigated these ways for time out of mind. Hail to the spirits of land and sea and sky who go through all of these changes with us. Blessed ones of transition, blessed ones of between, blessed ones of the liminal times. Thank you. Thank you for your example, for your wisdom, for your guidance, for your courage, so that we can bring our own to bear. Hail to the blessed ones who built the ways, who carried the ways forward, who taught the ways, who protected the ways. Hail to all the holy ones who are the ways. Whether the hearth fire, the shining stars above, the earth beneath our feet, or the constant companions with whom we share our lives, our communities. Thank you, holy ones, for your presence. Thank you, holy ones, for the between, for the in-between, and for the after. Hail to all the holy ones of the seasons. Astual. Welcome, welcome, welcome to another episode of Around Grandfather Fire. This is episode 143, the last of season 6, with my good friends and co-hosts, Snow and Emily Streaking Fate. How are you both doing tonight?
I am doing all right. It's hard to believe it is almost the end of the year, but I'm very excited for things coming up in the last few weeks. How about you, Snow?
Well, I mean, I've been fairly busy anyway, which is why the announcement that I normally put in the server was, 6.5 days late for recording this anyways. And then this morning I updated the computer and was like, okay, I'm all good to go. And then as usual, I come through sort of between an hour and half an hour before we start recording to get Zoom up and get all ready and prepped and just chill for a bit. And nothing was working. Just nothing. Just nothing. Just Zoom spinning and freezing and nothing. And so we are now starting recording over 3/4 of an hour after when we should have started. I am very tired and annoyed with technology. But I am here and you are here. And I apologize to producer Jason and the audience if I sound like crap, because instead of talking on my computer, which is going on a go slow, through the wonderful microphone, I'm using my iPad, which is 12 years old. So that's how I am.
If it means anything, I have heard way worse on better equipment.
Okay, that's good to know. Because, I'd been sitting there the past few days going, when I can afford it, I think I'm going to get a new desktop. And it must have heard me say that and be like, well, fuck you then. And so my old reliable iPad has gone, well, I'm still just fine. And so I'm using that instead.
It's wild to me that we live in a world now where we can say that my vintage equipment is 12 years old.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's weird to me to see there are famous people born after 2000. So,
Right?
like a significant number of actors and musicians, and I mean, the point where it got me was when I started seeing there were porn stars born after 2000. Because we're 24 years after 2000 now, so there is plenty of them.
Did it blow your mind?
I'm like, how do I mean they blow something, but that's their profession. But it's how do we get here?
1 year at a time.
Yeah. So yeah, that's how I am. How are you, Sarenth?
I'm doing pretty good, actually. I've slept well. The work OT situation has calmed down significantly, to the point where people are basically almost fist fighting each other for overtime now that we're in the holiday season. So I'm anticipating as soon as the holiday season drops, uh, things will go back to their normal snafu. Aside from that, the main things that I've been working on, I've got my Patreon posts done for the month. I am occasionally getting bit by the writing bug and just pounding out a 2,000 word essay in the course of a day or two. Um, Aside from that, I'm still working through the kinship books, which has been really neat. And I am on place, like belonging to place and developing relationship with place. And as a heathen, I'm very gratified to see that a lot of the perspectives that I hold and that I've seen you, Snow and Emily hold, and that many of our fellow heathens hold is incredibly similar to a lot of the people who've already jotted down their ideas in these books. It's it's kind of nice. It's like, okay, yeah, we may not be in the same waters, but we're all more or less on the same page, which is kind of a good feeling. So much of what I've been doing is relaxing. I know you all are shocked.
Mm. Hell hath
The
frozen over.
I mean, considering where we are at in Michigan, the wind chill.
Well,
Yes, it has.
mm,
Yes, and hell and paradise are about what 70, 80 miles from each other.
I mean, it's been a while since I heard those early Eminem records, but from how he describes some areas of Michigan, I can see it.
Mm-hmm. So, just keeping busy at this point. Um, one day at a time with regards to work and life. I'm just trying to get through the holiday season at this point. So I'm glad to hear that despite your tech issues, you're able to get on. That's excellent. And it just seems to be the case that we have so many tech and communication issues during this time of year.
Yes, we were supposed to do an episode recently with a guest, but unfortunately, day of recording, the guest became very ill, so that is being rescheduled for the future. Thankfully, both he and us are very excited for it to happen when we can do it, so it will happen, dear audience. It's just sorting out when. But yeah, that's kind of how our December is going around the fire.
I'm just happy that we've gotten through this sixth season, and it still is kind of wild to me that you both have only been on this show for a year, and it's been a real pleasure having both of you on and co-hosting.
Well, thank you for having us on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this has been a very good year, I think. We've gotten a lot of interesting guests that I would not have gone for, and a lot of interesting guests that I didn't know about. So a lot of my reflection in this past year has been really kind of taking gratitude for, well, not taking gratitude, but expressing gratitude for the opportunity to see so many new people that I would not have known to talk with or have known to reach out to.
Hmm. I mean, I know for myself, kind of one thing that I was sort of thinking going into, I mean, the podcast, but also this year was sort of broadening horizons and sort of reaching out to different groups and seeing what was happening in different places, talking to different places. Very much an aversion to retreading the same ground. So I'm glad you are also feeling kind of talk to people you wouldn't have done normally.
Whoop. Oh, okay. That wasn't an audio glitch. That was Emily laughing hard. Okay.
Sorry.
It's because Emily can see both of us looking at her like,
Ah.
Hey, Emily, do you have thoughts about how the show's been this year?
I was really curious to see how it would go. I was very excited when Sarenth decided that doing it all by himself was not maybe the way to go. I do think Snow and Cabra and all the guests added so much. And I do think the community too put in a lot of ideas that maybe people wouldn't have thought of, or that Sarenth on his own. I appreciate that despite all of the current hosts having a heathen aspect, we've had on a lot of guests that have not been heathen. I think that's been really, really good. I am excited and curious to see how it goes next year. I think I came into this year very hesitant and very excited. And also going through some other things that I'm hoping will be wrapped up a little bit by next year, but we will see. Hopefully there will be no hospital visits next year for Sarenth.
God's willing.
For anybody in the family would be hopeful. But yeah, I think it's been a really fascinating year with some of the different guests that we've had on. I am always amused when Sarenth is surprised that a guest says yes. For as long as he's been doing the show and for as much as he does, it always amuses me when he's like, he said yes. Like, yes, I do think that this year has been really fascinating with just meeting people on other paths, even outside of the show, and learning stuff about other paths outside of the show has also been a big thing. I think it will be very interesting next year because I think there's a lot more of that networking and communication lines opening up for people as a way to see where the communities are and connect people to, like, if they need help with something, as well as just like sharing ideas and different concepts of ways to approach things. So I'm excited for more community networking as well as bringing different people on the show.
Yeah, I want to give a really huge shout out to Cabra because a good number of those guests that were brought on the show was in part because they invited them on. And I really want to give a huge shout out to Cabra for all the time and energy that they gave to us this year. I know that at several points it was invariably either really busy or really intense for them, and huge kudos for them to stick with us as long as they did with everything they had going on. That was a blessing.
Yes, thank you, Capra.
And I have to give like a huge shout out to you both because I know that doing the show well it can be quite fun is also a big time investment. I know for you, Snow, this is that your recordings are done really late at night. I mean, I'm a midnighter, so like for me, this is like, oh yeah, we're just gonna be awake. But for your average listener, I don't think they quite appreciate that you're up at like midnight your time and recording for an hour or two or three, and whatever else we got going on after. So I really want to especially thank you for sticking out as much as you have and for putting as much work as you have into the podcast.
Some kind of metaphor for fires in the night.
And I also want to give like a shout out to you, Emily, for joining because I know that this took you on so many different ways out of your comfort zones and put you ground zero in a position you were initially really hesitant and not sure about. And I think you've grown into the podcast quite nicely.
There was definitely some growing pains from being your support for the podcast and making sure you had everything and everything was set up for you to go versus, oh, I need to get my stuff ready and get my stuff set up and focus on what I can add to the podcast. Also, huge thank you to Jason.
Yes.
This podcast would not go out at all without Jason.
Yes, I was going to say thank you, producer Jason, for all the exploited labor and all the shit we pile on that you then have to sift through, especially when we have chaotic and maniacal guests who suddenly decide they really need to play their guitars. And we just spend most of the episode apologizing to you because it just seems like it'll be a headache to edit.
That is a huge amount of work that when I was first considering doing the show on my own, I didn't really think about. And I'm really, really happy that Jason stepped up that way. Because, I've been doing the show with Jim and Caitlin for what, 5 years? And I hadn't done much of the editing on the back end. And so, like, I didn't realize at first what kind of back end work this show required. Because a lot of the time I was just like showing up, putting my voice into a mic, and then taking off for the evening. And Jim was doing all the back end work. Like, this is a lot of work. So, serious kudos.
Thank you for the home visits, Jason. For mic installation and coming by to make sure things are.
I hope Jason will be gratified to know
up.
that the mic is actually back where it was when he installed it.
Yes, the number of times where I'm messaging Jason or pinging Jason and going, could you just break into Sarenth's house and sort out his audio setup? Just move that mic, just something.
It helps that the basement is back together. That was the biggest impediment to the audio issues that I was having was because of where the laptop had to be, because I had to deconstruct my entire space to move all my equipment out of here so that the basement folks could remediate and the vapor barrier and do all the extra shit they had to do to get this place back to where it needed to be. And so my audio setup was jank for a little bit there because of where I was and how it was set up. So I appreciate your patience. Both my co-hosts and our sound engineer, because, yeah, that was a lot.
And cliche as it may be, sincerely thank you to our Patreon patrons, the AGF community, and any and all listeners, whether you listen once or every episode, whether you try it for 5 minutes or stick out the whole thing. Because without that, there wouldn't be a this. So thank you.
So, with all of our thank yous and looking back over the last year being said, and of course we can always U-turn on that as the mood takes us. Did we want to get into
You turn on it. No, screw you, Jason. We're not thankful at all. We changed our mind.
That's not what I meant.
You work for us, damn it.
You're all rotten pricks. Anyway, I was trying to do a segue into what our topic for the evening was.
It's very
thanks.
smooth. Carry on. You're welcome.
Oh, God. Okay, so we had a bunch of stuff we were going to cover in I think our last co-host episode. So we've got a bunch of stuff that we wanted to go through. So we've already done like the year in review, and I think the year ahead, I think leaving that for the end is probably still pretty good. But some of these topics I don't actually remember the context for anymore, because like death. I'm assuming these were from the Samhain that we're going to be recording. Okay.
Yeah, I think we were planning
Yes.
on doing a Samhain episode, but then we kind of wound up having so many wonderful guests that time kind of slipped by. And so we were going, well, maybe we can kind of squeeze that into a general Wild Hunt episode. And Wild Hunt links up with winter, so everything is crammed into the Yule episode.
Yeah.
So it's the Christmas Bonanza episode.
I mean, dead and death during this time of season actually makes sense, because I think it's long had associations with death and the dead, whether you look at it from the perspective of the Wild Hunt or whether you look at it from just the general feeling of this time of year. I mean, especially all three of us are heathens, so like the further north you go, the closer to death you are. The more cold you get, the more likely you are to die. It's kind of weird that way. So, I don't know. I suppose the first thing is, what differentiates the dead for you from just run-of-the-mill spirits?
Do you have thoughts, Emily? Do you want to go first?
My initial thought is, when I think of the dead, my first thought is of the human dead. So spirits that had human lives before. However, there's also non-human dead. Pets, other animals, or you could even say plant spirits. So I would say what differentiates dead spirits from other spirits, or the spirits of the dead from other spirits, is that they've had at least one lifetime embodied.
Okay, that makes sense to me.
I think for me, spirits is a very broad and nebulous group and is very much a miscellaneous other category, whereas the dead are those who had some physical, mortal, corporeal existence that has then ceased, and they are now elsewhere, or many elsewheres, and in another place or another state or what have you. Whereas for me, spirit in this context is other things, so beings that don't or didn't have physical, material, corporeal forms. So the kind of, I mean, for me, that's everything from sort of elves and dwarves through to the spirit of a city, or the spirit of a mountain, or the spirit of a book, or the spirit of music, or the spirit of learning, or angels, or all kinds of things like that.
So that that makes a lot of sense to me. A lot of my perspective kind of follows along with that as well, both of your perspectives on it. I think that I appreciate that you both have mentioned like other than human dead because I think that's sometimes missed. Sometimes the okay, they're human, therefore they're the dead kind of gets pushed forward, and I'm not sure if that's necessarily just because you were humans and that's what we think of first, or because of the things like the spiritualist movement. But I, yeah, my concept of the dead is very encompassing. So it's also the way that I think of death. It's a pretty much a universal. If you're corporeal in some way, shape, or form, you're gonna die, even if it takes an exceptionally long time, like planets, stars, you name it. I mean, there's an origin point and there's an end point. Um, I suppose that the question is, what does death as a force, as a being, as a concept play in your understanding of things? Um, in terms of not only like what the boundary line between living and dead is, but is it okay, so we have this existence over here and this existence over here, never the twain shall meet, or is it more like a this is a really fucking thin barrier and you have just to shuffle off this mortal coil and there you are. Um, I suppose that's kind of where I'm sitting as I'm looking at our questions and topics for the evening.
Hmm. I mean, I think if you look at kind of a basic, quote unquote, basic, sort of general, broad pagan or new agey kind of idea of sort of looking at summer and looking at the veil and looking at winter, spring and autumn are those liminal transitional periods between sort of summer where it's the brightest bright and winter where you get the darkest dark, which is the case whether it's the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere. All the changes of the calendar months where you get those seasons. And so I think for me, in terms of the living and the dead and sort of where those boundaries are, I think for me that is very sort of elastic and fluid and moving and shifting. And sometimes there are sort of thicker and more concrete barriers, and sometimes there are very much not, and it varies and fluctuates a lot for all kinds of reasons, depending on what's happening for us in our realm, what's happening for them where they are, depending on the time of day, the time of year, where you are, or sort of all kinds of things. That's kind of my initial rambling thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would agree with Snow that I think there's a lot of fluctuation. Fluctuation. Well, some of it might depend on environment, some of it might depend on time, some of it might depend on the specific person, either like the living or the dead. I don't know if I ever feel the veil becoming thinner or thicker, so to speak, based on a specific time of year, but I do think I tend to pay more attention at specific times of the year. But I do think the boundary itself can fluctuate for many, many different reasons. And again, I do think for some people, the boundary is just thinner all the time. And for some people, it's just thicker for any number of reasons. What about you, Sarenth?
Yeah, a lot of my perspective on death is that it's a transition, like in its in its finality for physical life, it is a transition point, but it's also it's crossed back and forth. I mean, whether you're talking about like say resuscitation where somebody is completely flat brain dead and you somehow get their heart pumping and get their brain working and they're back. The it's liminal space for a reason, right? And when people are like, "Oh, the veil is really thin," I'm like, "Yeah, it's a veil." Weird. Um, I I think that there are places where it's easier to perceive the spirits, either because, again, like you both mentioned, environmental factors, or in terms of this place has been hit by XYZ thing, and for some reason the spirits just like congregating here. I think that death is a god and is a force and is a state of being, and we it's one of a few fixed points in life. It's just a question of when, not if. So I find that for me, tackling the question of death is was deeply important from transitioning out of Christianity into heathenry, not only because of all the baggage that comes with the salvific narrative, but also in terms of what does the afterlife even fucking look like? Like, is there an afterlife? Is this just an assumption I've brought into heathenry? When I first became a pagan, I had exceptionally vague ideas, and over time got more concrete the more that I studied, the more that I looked at things, the more that I experienced. But in the end, I still look back and like death is this kind of three pronged thing where it's a creature, a being, it's a place, a time, and it's also an experience. And I think that having to grapple with that so early in my journey was helpful because I didn't have this issue where I kind of put these questions aside and looking at some of these theological issues right in the face was a really neat way to deconstruct from my Catholicism. And so I think that you can, like any kind of pondering, you can take it too far and you can take it to some really disturbing places, but I don't think that necessarily needs to be the case. I mean, if you would just accept that as a fact of life, everything dies, a lot of the oomph factor of the processing of the idea goes away, or at least I find it lessened. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, if you can sort of um, normalize something, then it's less shocking and less upsetting. Not that um, loss is something to kind of be apathetic about, but just accepting that it is a part of life, and we have these different parts of the cycle, and they're there for different reasons, and there's an importance and significance to that. Um, I mean, the death positivity movement kind of taken off and grown as it has for a reason, and I think it's a very healthy thing. Um, and being able to accept something or tolerate something or acknowledge something is not the same as actively seeking it out, is not the same as desiring it. It's just sort of acknowledging that it's there and it's a thing, and sort of having blinkers on doesn't help.
Yeah. I think for me, the thing that really kind of revolutionized my thinking on death was thinking of myself as an ancestor in the making. And I can definitely attribute that to my heathen worldview developing over the years, the way that it has. And it was like, okay, well, why are we asking all these questions about reputation? Why are we asking these questions about your place in the community and all this? Well, some aspect of you is probably going to live on after you die. And that's, take the tack from the Havamal with, you know, cattle die, kinsmen die. Okay, well, what does that look like? What does that even mean? Why am I that concerned with it? Well, that's because you're an ancestor in the making. And for me, that transition of acceptance from I'm just another human being to I am going to be somebody's ancestor, you know, and I think this holds true whether you have kids or not. You're going to be somebody's ancestor. And that, to me, brings that relationality and obligation into everyday life and choice.
And I mean, that also leads into sort of considering how you go about living your life. Because if you're spending every moment thinking about how it will impact those that follow and that which follows, sort of the past setting up the now and the now setting up that which will inevitably follow, then that kind of informs how you go about your day to day, how you interact with people, how you talk about people. And kind of you can have conversations off of that that are sort of comparable to the how would you live this day if it were your last kind of thing. You know, would you want this to have been your last words to such and such a person? And then you hear those kinds of statements and conversations amongst Christians and atheists and so on. And I think it's just kind of a sort of pagan parallel to that, really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And like in my practice, I see any healing that I'm able to do on myself or receive helps to heal the ancestors behind me and the ancestors in front of me. So for me, living my life in a way that helps myself also helps the ancestral line, and as well the ancestors that have lived before and the ancestors that have yet to be born. Because I see it as working in both directions. So I would say that's kind of how I see myself as an ancestor in the making, or view that perspective of ancestors.
I guess this kind of brings the question, like when we say ancestors, what do we mean? Because I think that it's one of those things where it's kind of like spirit. It's such a nebulous concept that it helps to kind of narrow down what we're talking about. Because I don't just think of these as human ancestors in my case. They're certainly among them, but not exclusively.
Right. And I mean, especially because we see a lot of people for whom the term ancestor is anyone who's died and lived prior to their existence. But we also see people who use the term exclusively for familial or even biological predecessors. And so I think that those two mean quite different things, and one is a lot broader than the other. And so if you were looking to sort of spirit ancestors or the ancestors who are teachers or innovators or founders or practitioners of a certain tradition or path or craft or religion or occupation or what have you, then that's a lot broader than simply familial predecessors.
Yeah, I like to say ancestors of blood and bone, ancestors of spirit, which includes chosen family, as well as like non-corporeal beings, as well as basically anybody you want to choose, and ancestors of lineage, which I would also, they could be a magical lineage, but I would also say your career path, ancestors that you, people that you venerate, that were maybe ceiling breakers, for lack of better wording, on your career path. So for me, the term ancestors incorporates a lot of different beings. But I will also say that there are ancestors that I work with, and there are ancestors that either choose not to work with me or that I will choose not to work with. And I think that's something that people sometimes are afraid of approaching their ancestors, because either the ancestors that they're aware of, they don't want to contact or work with or ask for help, or because there's one ancestor that they don't want in their space. And I do think if you do honor your ancestors, you're allowed, just like if you have people over at your house, you're allowed to say you're not invited, you're not welcome here, I am not dealing with you.
I was just thinking that kind of links into conversations that we're seeing around this time of year about sort of family and friends and festivities, where it's, navigating, finding out revelations about people's past deeds or past words, navigating forgiveness and redemption, and navigating conflicts, navigating ongoing things as well as past things, and sort of how healthy it is to hold on to things, how justified you are in holding on to things, whether, forgiveness and redemption are options for you for one reason or another. And I think that sort of connects there as well. And because, one thing we see a lot when people start talking about ancestors is, well, my 17 times great grandparent stabbed someone and stole a cow, or some, my 5 times grandparent owned slaves, my 3 times grandparent was on the wrong side of this war, and sort of things like that. And sort of people navigate that in all kinds of different ways, from having nothing to do with them to going, well, they must have made the right decisions that they thought at the time, or we'd have viewed things differently in different points of time, and so on. And so kind of where people draw those lines and sort of how they navigate that really varies a lot, and becomes very individualistic, in the same way that people sort of navigate group rituals at this time of year, but also family gatherings for different festivities and things, and whether they participate or whether they abstain for whatever reason.
When it comes to ancestors, I hear some folks who define ancestors as only those ancestors that are whole and healthy and are like part of your lineage. Like, generally speaking, they're talking about blood ancestors, but I have an expanded view of ancestors as well. I wonder if you both have a similar perspective, or if yours is different to that definition of what an ancestor is. Namely, are your ancestors, who are your ancestors? Are they all healthy and whole and good for you, or are they all over the map in terms of like what their backgrounds are, what their wholeness, haleness, whatever you have to insert word here?
All right, I'm with you now. Go on, Emily.
I would say I view my ancestors to be on all kinds of different levels. Some are whole and healthy, and I definitely lean on the whole and healthy ones to help organize my ancestral lines. But I don't think when I said, as I heal myself, I heal my ancestors, I'm talking about the ones that are maybe not quite yet whole and healthy. And when I do offerings, I tend to do offerings to all of my ancestors. But if I'm asking an ancestor for help, or if I'm asking a specific question, I might be more directed. Or I might ask my whole and healthy ancestors to direct the energy from the ancestors as a whole. Because early on in my practice, I made the mistake of thinking because the ancestors were dead, that meant they were all of a sudden all knowledgeable, and there was no pettiness, and everything was like they were way above me. It didn't occur to me until later on that some of them might still have some very human aspects, especially the ones that had not been dead as long. And that becoming whole and healthy is a choice, and like death is a transition in my mind, and there's continuing transitions potentially afterwards and the ability to grow afterwards, but some people might not choose to grow afterwards. So like when I do offerings and such, I do tend to include all of my ancestors, but if I'm asking for something specific, I will lean on my whole and healthy ancestors to kind of keep things in line. Yeah.
I mean, my thinking was kind of, I think it's somewhat naive to try and look for perfect, flawless ancestors, because there are no perfect, flawless humans. And whether or not that changes after people die, you hear all kinds of different views and arguments for. Because, I mean, I know necromancers and death workers who say that after people die, they get a different sense of perspective, a different sense of scale, and the things that they were maybe sort of riled up about, they understand doesn't really matter anymore, or they were wrong about, or what have you. But I also see ones who say, well, the views they had then, they're still holding on to, they're just being stubborn and things like that. And you sort of see both stated and implied the things about the dead being, I don't want to say closer to, but maybe more in commune with the gods, and so more sort of open to messages and teachings there in different ways. But then sort of if you start looking at reincarnation, does that throw everything there? Or if they go into different realms and different realms belong to different gods, does that sort of impact things there? So you get all kinds of different views there, and sort of people draw their lines where they will. But I mean, I see a lot of newcomers to sort of heathenry and other pagan religions, of people going, well, you know, I want to find an ancestor who was always honest, always truthful, always hardworking, always loving, always kind, always caring. And you sort of sit there and go, okay, go find one living person who is always truthful, always honest, always kind, always caring, always hardworking, always punctual, never forgets anything, you know. And it's that whole kind of perfection is a myth sort of thing. Which then also kind of circles back to my earlier point about sort of people drawing their lines where they will, and sort of individually navigating sort of acceptance and forgiveness and redemption and grudges and all of that. And that was my kind of train of thought to your question there.
Yeah. I think that expecting perfection is kind of goofy on its face. I'm certainly never going to be perfect, but I'm certainly going to be an ancestor. And whoever comes after me that wants to deal with that, you know, I'm sorry. I think for me, what really matters in terms of what is an ancestor versus what's not is, do you claim some kind of descent from them, or do they claim you in some sort of descent? And it's relationality, right? Like, you know, it doesn't matter if it's somebody that's in your field of study or work. It doesn't matter if, I mean, and I do not idly use the name Odinson. I definitely believe that Othin is both a god and an ancestor. I think these things are not mutually exclusive. You know, whether you look at it from the mythology of creating the world out of Ymir's corpse, whether you look at it from the perspective of he had some personal hand in me coming to where I am and how, or maybe when I became a heathen because of how he dragged me kicking and screaming into things, maybe that's the point at which I became an Odinson. There's a lot of different ways to interpret that. And I'm actually okay with the vagaries of the interpretation. I don't think that it does us a whole lot of good to 100% this must be the only way that we can relate to an ancestor. Because I don't fucking know. There are some gods that I will never relate to because I don't know them. There are some ancestors that I simply will never come into relationship with because for some reason or another we don't click or we never crossed paths. It doesn't make them not an ancestor. It just doesn't mean that I relate. It just means that I don't relate to them. And so for me, the question of ancestry is do we relate? Like, are we relations? I can look at the ground and underneath my feet and go, that is an ancestor. I look at fire and ice, the embodiment of the elements, as literal eldest ancestors. So for me, elder is very broad, very tall, very short, very everywhere at once, and also within us. So, and what an ancestor is to me, it's just kind of it's more a question of what kind than it is or what way are you relating, as opposed to, I mean, it's kind of like with the spirits question earlier, right? How are you relating? In what way are you relating? Because spirits of the land can be ancestors too. One of the classic questions that I love when people ask and I love when people answer is, at what point does a dead person become a land spirit if they're hanging out in their grave long enough? Um, because watching people's gears turn and smoke occasionally is really goddamn fun as they start to parse, at what point does this person disappear and they just become the stone, or do they become part of the ground, or what have you? I find these questions fun. So when it comes to things like ancestors and how we relate to them, and things like liminal seasons, I suppose kind of taking the tack with ancestors is a question of relationality, and what is liminal is kind of dependent on what your normal is, right? Like if you're used to everything being thick and cold, well, warm seasons are liminality, right? Uh, if you're used to everything being really fucking warm, well, a cold snap can be a liminal time. I've never lived where it's sunny all the time. I've always lived in Michigan, so I'm as much as climate change is jacking up my sense of normality. There's still definitely this is definitely fall, this is definitely winter, this is definitely spring, this is definitely summer. There's definite things that I look for in the environment to tell me, hey, we're transitioning now, bud. And sometimes it's literally like looking
Hmm.
up at the trees and going, oh, buds in the trees. Okay, we're transitioning out of winter now.
I'm curious then if for you, liminal doesn't just mean a transition, but could also just be anything that's abnormal and temporary.
Liminal, yes. Liminal season, no. Because I think for me, it's the nicety of, is the season halfway, or is it halfway over, or is it transitioning to something else? I think transition is perhaps, I guess it's a yes and, but also no and.
Because for me, the term liminal and things being liminal is always sort of the transition point. It's that where the water meets the sand. It's as we go through autumn, as we go through spring. It's the lines, it's the hedges, it's the blurs, the smudges. But you're saying there, if you're used to cold weather, then hot weather becomes liminal. It sort of has me thinking, oh, are you using it in a different way then, where suddenly it's just anything that's atypical and abnormal?
Kind of. Um,
Okay.
I mean, I still very much grok the understanding of liminal as like transition points and things like that. But liminal,
Hmm.
I mean, I have felt liminal space at a funeral, but I don't feel that in normal church mass, for instance. Sometimes it's context dependent. Like if
Right.
there's a dead person in front of me, that's a different story than say, funny enough, Jesus hanging on a crucifix. Um,
Hmm.
you know, as a former Catholic, like one of these things is normal to be expected. One of these things is not. So I guess my concept of liminality can be context dependent,
Okay.
which is frustrating because I do actually like definitions. But yeah, please go ahead. I'm sorry, Emily.
No, you're good. I think my definition is maybe, or my view is a little closer to Snow's, and that I see liminal as like the point of transition. I think the sand meeting the water was a great example that Snow gave. I do think there's certain times of year that I feel are liminal, um, like the Pagamental days right before Weprompet. Um, I do think the the last couple weeks of the year always feel very liminal for me. Um, but for me, liminal space is always just like a step away, so to speak. Um, so I feel like liminal is something almost very familiar for me. Um, it's something in a way it's kind of set because that point of transition is always there and you can step into it or step through it if you need to, when it comes to liminal space. Um, so I think there's a normality in it, which might be a little bit different from how you view it, Sarenth.
Can you ask that again?
Uh, I wasn't asking anything. I was just saying that for me,
Sorry,
limin.
my
It
my
wasn't
brain
a
had a
question.
No, it was a
skip.
question.
I need you.
No, you're good.
Hmm.
I was just saying that for me, like there are liminal times of year, but when it comes to liminality in a
Mhm.
spatial sense, like this world and the other world, the point where they meet is like a
Mhm.
liminal point, the point in between. I think of liminal as being an in between space or time. Um, for me, that point is often accessible, or it's a place where I am often enough that for me, liminality is a very normal, almost set thing. There's always a place where things meet. There's always an in between space that you can step into.
Okay.
So for me, there's a normal, almost stable point of liminality, if that makes sense, that
Yeah,
juxtaposition a little bit.
that makes sense. I think most often of Crossroads, but I think Snow's earlier example also makes the point too. Yeah, that makes okay. I appreciate you re-explaining that. Um, because I'm pretty sure I skipped something somewhere and I was like, this sounds correct, but I'm not sure what I'm not processing. That makes sense.
But one thing I think we could all agree isn't liminal is winter. So, symbolically, what does winter mean for you guys?
So when I think of winter, I think of coolness. I think of pause, meditation. I think of the like for me, like the penultimate winter thing is to go outside and there's snow on the ground and ice, and uh everything is just dead quiet. It's for me that is that's winter. That is the dead time, the quiet time, the meditative time.
Um, being in Michigan now, I was in Oklahoma for 4 years, and they had intense ice storms, but they didn't have a lot of snow. So being back in a place that has snow, I do connect winter with snow, animal footprints in the snow, a very quiet time because the snow will kind of dampen sound. Um, but I see it as a very active under the earth time. A lot going on like under the earth, a lot going on behind closed doors. A time where you can have more fires, light more candles, and it's not going to be too hot. So I definitely see it as a time of fire and very much a time of like being in the home. Earth and home, I think, are really big for me over winter. That time of being inside, being with the family. So those are all key points. I drink hot drinks all year round as well as cold drinks, but an excuse for more tea, mulled wine, more maybe baked goods, sweet treats. Um, Again, these are things that I might indulge all year, but winter is definitely a like comfort, sensory comforts in the home. What about you, Snow? What is winter for you?
I mean, one thing I've always struggled to kind of picture or envision is winter in a hot climate. Being from the northern hemisphere, being from sort of northwestern Europe and the archipelago of the British and Irish Isles, kind of the idea of this time of year in Australia or this time of year in Argentina or something like that's always been really sort of challenging me to try and understand. So I would love to travel to the southern hemisphere at some day during this time of year to try and see what that's like. But for me, winter is very much dark long nights and dark late mornings, and it's cold, and if it hasn't snowed then it's rained, and chances are if it thought about snowing it's just slushy outside, and you either need more layers than you've got or you're wearing way too many layers and you're sweating, which is unreasonable. And there's a very kind of, I mean, there's a lot of sort of fire in the darkness, but also a lot of darkness in the fire of winter, I think. It's very much sort of winter often reminds me of why I started worshipping Skadi in the first place in sort of my teens. It's that kind of, there is warmth and laughter and friendship, but sort of if you get lost out there in the middle of winter, that's bleak, that's rough. Both sort of very literally and physically, but also sort of metaphorically or emotionally. And sort of it's kind of, it can be sort of something of a knife's edge there. And so for me, winter is kind of an interesting mix of sort of you know, alcoholic drinks and dancing around the kitchen to stuff that seems atypical to be listening to at that time of year, but also drinking tea and listening to My Dying Bride records and looking out the window and rereading Poe. And it's kind of all of that.
Interesting. So a lot of your wintertime stuff is very Samhain coded, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I mean, I think because I mean, in my practice, the wild hunt kind of
emerges sort of between when most people celebrate Samhain and when most people sort of observe Yule. And then that kind of runs through to kind of late January, maybe early February, depending on when the moons fall and how the seasons are acting. And so it's that kind of the spirits, the thinning of the veil and the wild hunt commencing. And so because that's happening out there, we're all huddled in here with our food stores and our warmth and our cheer sort of against the wild hunt out the window. And a lot of wild hunt prayers for me have always been to kind of that they do what they seek out to do and that the rest of us not get caught in the foray.
That makes a great deal of sense. Yeah. I could see why a lot of practices from one prototypical area of time would bleed into the other. And I think that kind of follows with what we still have left to us from these time periods folklorically and from what remains to us through the heathen sources as well. The barring of people to come in during like Alpha Bloat, for instance, comes to mind as kind of a through line that kind of makes sense alongside with the Wild Hunt. Like, no, this is the time where we take care of the spirits, and the spirits leave us the fuck alone, or they go across the lane over there. We're not letting you in case you are the Wild Hunter. You bring them with you. Good luck, Chuck. Um, I find it really interesting that a lot of the hospitality things are kind of suspended during that particular period of time, or at least they're not as readily observed.
You also see a lot of kind of end of calendar year, beginning of calendar year practices and customs and folklore around sort of entering and exiting houses and sort of things like that, sort of related to your point there. You sort of see a lot of sort of folk tales and folklore of, you know, the first thing you see on the morning of the 1st of January will foretell how the year will go, or the last thing you see on the 31st of December, and sort of those kinds of customs and practices, you know, sort of considering the manner or the occupation of the first visitor to the house during the festive period, or the manner of how you leave the house during the festive period, and sort of how those kinds of things kind of ripple out and impact things there. Sort of thinking about that sort of crossing.
Yeah. I yeah, that liminality kind of just follows you all over the place, doesn't it? And it's almost
Yeah, I was just thinking that crossing the threshold and going through doorways is very liminal during a period where I said is very not liminal. So you still kind of get micro liminalities in a big macro not liminal. Yeah.
it's really interesting too. I think that there's so many practices from this time of the year, which is like around prophecy and foretelling. And maybe it's just got something to do with the season, or maybe it's got, something to do with everything being kind of shut down. But I think to the like the Arsgong, the year walk, in which you're supposed to be able to receive prophetic visions of the future, depending on if you keep quiet and you don't smile, or kind of like bright character while you're stoically walking around and looking for signs from nature. I think it's you walk from a graveyard to a church, which is funny because you can pretty much do that. Walk down the street. I think it's walk from your house to a church with a graveyard or something like that. Um, and you do this for like 9 years, and it's supposed to reveal some power to you. Um, Rune talks about it quite a bit in his Nordic Animism YouTube videos, and I find that kind of intentionally seeking liminality during the quiet time, what I perceive as really quiet, um, to be very interesting because you kind of have to go and seek it out. Like the esoteric, you kind of have to really like during this period of time go and seek it out. Like a lot of folklore around the opposite time of the year. It's kind of like this shit'll find you. Like when you're talking like summertime, like stay off the mounds, stay away from anything that could be possibly fairy touched or elf touched. Leave it the fuck alone. Whereas in winter, it's kind of like you have to go out and look for stuff.
I think some things will come looking for you, but it might just be different than what it would be during maybe the warmer times of year.
No, that's true. I think of Grilla or the Yule cotton or the Krampus. You know, these kinds of boundary keeping.
Yeah. And I guess if it might not be, it might be things that you interact with on the daily, like your house spirits or gods or other spirits that are connected to your household or your family lines. I see winter as a big time for, you talked about like prophecy, planning for the new year, because it is a time where you're less able to get out and about and do things. So it's a great time for planning the year to come. But yeah. And if you do happen to get out, you can definitely interact depending with some gods and spirits, such as Skathi or Uller. Um, and they will sometimes find you, even if you are not looking for them.
Yeah. Yeah. So as we're transitioning the conversation into Samhain Yuletide, I suppose that's kind of where, especially given we're coming up. It's the 14th as a time of this recording, and we're 7 days away from where most people reckon Yule falls, and so the Yuletide is kind of like it's right here, it's almost here. Uh, and it's interesting how a kind of, at least here in the States, a kind of mania starts to take hold around this time of year, because this is when people start shitting their pants and going, "Oh fuck, I haven't bought anything for Christmas." Um, and I wonder, there's times like this where I wonder what our ancestors would have thought, because like, um, you've got people that used to, the scenes that used to play of people mobbing like the Walmarts and stuff like that, and that's given way to like fleets of trucks going out in the weeks preceding um, Christmas and Yule. And so, when I think of like, okay, our ancestors probably celebrated this way, and this, especially this time of year, you know, back not even like 2 generations ago, getting an orange during this period of time was actually a big fucking deal. And now we're just like, yeah, we got oranges whenever. It's very interesting to me, like thinking of it in this perspective, as somebody that does care a bit about Reconstruction and does care about like historical precedent. Thinking about it from that perspective of what would this have meant to ancestors back not a generation or two ago, or maybe even longer, because we have such access that sometimes it can be really hard to get back there, right? I don't know. I'm hoping I'm not rambling on this too much, but it's just
No, it's just making me think about grandparents telling stories about rationing during wartime, and then kind of seeing kids sitting there at Christmas and being like, "You spoilt little." It's like we had one ball we had to share between the five of us. You guys are crying because you only got 12 chocolates instead of 13 in the set. You haven't even touched the pile over there.
God. I wonder if that's just a thing you do more as you get older, but that's kind of like, that's actually a point that is actually really important, because when was the last time an American family faced wartime like that? I mean, when it comes to World War II, we didn't. I mean, yeah, we rationed, but it wasn't like you folks, and it wasn't like a multi-generational rationing project where some of your rations didn't fall off until what, the 60s?
Yeah, we were rationing until the early 60s, yeah.
Producing shit, we didn't know it. We didn't wasn't like that for over here. Like,
I mean, it wasn't until like the 80s where everything got properly built up again after all the bombing. Like you see news footage, and I mean, if you watch any documentary on UK punk, you see all the people running ground rubble in Birmingham and London in the 70s from bombed out factories and stuff like that. You know, they were still telling kids in school what to do if they went playing in a field and found an unexploded bomb.
damn.
So, you know, that's I guess still lingers in sort of family consciousness. Whereas if you were, you know, in the Midwest, I would imagine it's a different experience.
Yeah. I mean, I've got ancestors who would talk about the Great Depression in
Mm-hmm.
those kinds of tones,
Mm-hmm.
but we didn't have anything like the Blitz, where it was like this
Right.
multi-generational traumatic event that tore at our country
Mm-hmm.
in that very visceral way. I mean, like, don't get me wrong, like the 20s sucked for everybody,
Mm-hmm.
but it was like it's a different beast. It's a different beast, and it's a different feeling to the stories than what I've heard from folks coming out of the Blitz.
Mm. I
It's
mean, I think the other thing that kind of gets overlooked, even in history books here, is that the Great Depression between the two world wars wasn't just a US thing either.
right.
Like that happened in loads of countries around the world. I don't want to say it was entirely global, but it happened in lots and lots of countries, and even here. I mean, I had older parents, and my maternal granddad was born in 1920,
Oh,
and
okay.
he remembers as a kid going to miners' strikes, and then he went and fought in World War II. So I mean, that's a lot to see right there.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, my dad when he died in October was 88. And he remembers being a kid in Ireland during what they called the emergency, because that was sort of Ireland's neutrality during World War II, seeing British and German planes dogfighting above while he was trying to sleep as a kid, you
God.
know. So when you kind of hear stories like that, it's you know, easier for me to understand and empathize when I hear about people going, oh, my nan's always complaining I'm spoiling the kids too much because they wanted a Wii U and I only got him a Wii.
Right. Right. I I mean, we associate them with like, oh, these damn kids these days, and you get the old
Mm-hmm.
person voice on, and oh, they're so out of touch. And it's like, no, actually, like they're if you actually listen to their lived experience, you might actually be the one out of touch.
Yeah, it's, you know,
It's,
I
it,
mean, I think
this is a
part of
generational
it's
push and pull thing, though, too, right?
right. I mean, every wave is followed by a counter wave,
Mhm.
whether it's, you know, fashion styles or music styles or approaches to life and living, and you know, people saving money, people spending money, people having money, kind of all kinds of things. And I think also that whole kind of, as you get older, values and priorities shift, and you can kind of take a larger view if you've had more years to look back on,
Mhm.
that kind of thing.
Well, yeah, and even just the fact that the kids' brains are still developing and still forming the ability to make the like logical connections with the outside world and such.
Well, that's a fair point. I suppose that's actually something that I find interesting is when people like kind of put the wheel of the year onto like physically human lifespans. It's something that I see sometimes with folks who talk about medicine wheel teachings and how different parts of the medicine wheel correspond to different parts of the year, and those correspond to different times in our development as people. and kind of like pulling back the lens and thinking of it symbolically, like I think of winter in that regard and Yuletide as kind of, yeah, it's the darkest period, so it's got the associations with death, but it's also like this is when your preparations and your storage and your things really come into fruition. So this is like, I think of it as like kind of a combination of middle age and death, because like all the stuff that you've done up to this point suddenly becomes really relevant to live and to preserve your well-being. So, if we kind of like pull things back and into like a symbolic kind of idea, and you think of it like in terms of human lifespan, that's kind of where my mind goes, is like it's that contemplative experience of looking around and being like, okay, we've been here before. This is how we get through this. And especially when it comes to Yuletide, like sometimes it kind of feels like that's what you got to do to get through the season. Like, we've done this before, we will do it again. It's okay, just put your head down and go. Um, because for a lot of families, this can be a really trying time, not only from the perspective of like trying to make it a good holiday season, but from the perspective of just, I know for our family, this is when shit tends to go the most wrong with cars.
Mm.
Like if a car's going to break down, it's gonna start breaking down around between Samhain and Yuletide,
Gremlins.
almost inevitably. I'm telling you, I'm telling you.
Gremlins. Who went to the old Chinese shop and bought Gizmo?
You know, I fed the little fucker after midnight. It's my own fault.
It is.
But he was
You
just so
shouldn't have done it.
cute.
Got him wet, and now they're everywhere.
Oh man.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think astrologically,
Oh
like
yeah.
the deepest of winter, that's when you get the signs associated with Saturn. They're the signs that's the planet the furthest out, that's the coldest planet, but it's also the oldest, kind of mythologically speaking.
Right.
And that's Capricorn and Aquarius. It's icy cold, facts, logic, what's standing the test of time. If it isn't, just scrap it. We need something else. And it's Aquarian kind of visions for the greater humanity kind of moving forward. And then you go through another Jupiter sign with Pisces, and then Aries comes through with that, fiery Martian energy, and you're into a new year then. And kind of, I mean, thinking about sort of chapters of life and such, kind of if you go into sort of the idea of a Saturn return being when someone has properly transitioned into adulthood, because they're kind of a third of their way through life.
Oh, okay.
Because, that's around when they're kind of 28, 29, 30, 31. That's when you get your Saturn return.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that childhood, adolescence is closed. You're now becoming who you are fully, and your adult self is sort of realized from all this kind of incubation and training and trying things out and experimenting, and now we're seeing what sticks for you. And so,
That's cool. I didn't realize it was that chock full of the symbolism of astrology flowed quite as well with my understanding of the season, but that's really cool. That's really neat.
I mean, the kind of months don't map one for one, because it's an arbitrary 30 days and 31 days, but roughly speaking, yeah. And I mean, also just kind of talking about development and growth in sort of traditional astrology, when they talk about house perfection years, so that's kind of activating one house of the chart for each year.
Mm-hmm.
And because there are 12 houses and then it goes around again, the year that you're born, you're like 0 years old, but that's the first house, because there is no house 0, because 0 comes from the Arabic world, not the Greek world.
Right.
But the house of self would be the activated house for your first year of life. And when you're a newborn baby, all you know is yourself.
Okay.
And then you move on a year and you're a bit older, and suddenly you're realizing there are parents there. There's another person here. And then you move on another year, and there are siblings too. And then you move on another year, and there's a house. I can walk around the house, and there are things. And what does this do? And what if I put my finger in the plug socket? And it's that kind of progression around the thing.
Yeah.
So by the end, you get to, there's a wider world out there, and there are communities and towns and school and teachers, and someday I have to get a job, and
it's a persistent world outside of me. It doesn't just shut off when I shut my eyes. Weird.
Right. And then you kind of turn 12, 13, and you're back round to, okay, so who am I in all of this? And then who are my parents in all of this? And then it kind of cycles round again. And so then that's kind of interesting to kind of think about and live through and observe sort of from an astrological point of view as well. Because that kind of feeds into this heathen idea of things being cyclical, and the emphasis being on cyclical and not circular, because they're not the same thing. Right. And kind of astrology being cyclical and the seasons being cyclical, and when people talk about Weirden Orlog, that being cyclical, and it's not circular because circles go back to the same point.
Right.
Cycles don't go back to the same point; they keep moving forward. Like this winter won't be identical to the winter before or the winter ahead.
Right.
But we will get to another winter. And that's kind of the difference between it being a cycle and a circle. But you kind of see parallels there for myself in my sort of different traditions and practices between those kinds of cycles and the messages there.
Yeah, you got me in the contemplative mood on that, because it's like 2 days to my birthday. I'm gonna be 39, which is like, wow, all right. And I thought, man, I was hot shit hitting 30, and it's like, wow, you just have no idea, kid. That whole idea of really like figuring things out, and okay, I'm charting my path from here forward. Especially for this time of year, makes a lot of sense. I'm a Sag, so like kind of haphazardly shooting the bow in the air sometimes, but
Because because that first Saturn return is when you're around 30, and then the second one is when you're around 60, and then those who are fortunate will have a third around sort of 90. And there's kind of that idea of kind of sectioning chapters of life. And that's also why sort of as an astrologer for friends and clients in the past, I've kind of done a quick little kind of, here's your perfection year from this birthday to your next birthday, and the planets that will be the one to look to for the year, and that kind of thing. Because that can often be kind of interesting to kind of consider and look at, because perfection years go from birthday to birthday because it's about you. They don't go from January 1st to, the next 1st of January, because that isn't about you. That's about the arbitrary Western decision of how we break down and measure time so that we can all turn up to work at the same time.
Interesting. That's giving me food for thought. I may have to pick your brain on that later.
Sure. So, before we kind of head towards wrapping up, did we want to get to Brandon's questions?
Yeah, I think that's great.
Because we had 2 questions from listener Brandon on our Discord server, which you too can join from aroundgrandfatherfire.com, and you don't have to be a Patreon member to do so. Consider joining today. Terms and conditions are those of Discord. Don't blame us. So, the first question we had from Brandon, and Emily kind of already answered for herself here earlier. She may want to change her mind. She may just repeat herself. But I will say the question regardless. Brandon says, What's your favorite wintertime treat or drink?
Okay, there were two things that came to mind with this. Um, I really like mulled wine, and I think of that as a specifically like wintry seasonal holiday drink. However, um, when I first became pagan, I was living in Nebraska, and I have friends there, and they used to raise bees and make their own mead, and they would have a sumble every Yule. So before I was any part of my practice was even heathen, I would celebrate Yule with mead, having a sumble at my friend's house. So for me, mead is what comes to mind first, even though it's something that I will drink any time of year, for any kind of celebration. But mead and mulled wine were the two that came to mind for winter time treat or drink. What about you, Sarenth?
Hmm. I think for me, what I think of during this time, partly because I brew, so this is usually when the brewing tends to be done. Uh,
He means literally, not emotionally.
yes, thank you, Snow. Yeah, I brew
Emily
mead.
is shrugging for those of you at home.
Um, yeah,
Both can be a thing.
I'll just stand over top of my cardboard going, "Are you done yet? Where's the Joker?" Um, no, this is about the time when the mead actually finishes, and so this is usually about the time when we do bottling. This is what I think of. Sometimes I start a new batch around this time of year too, so it's like endings and beginnings. Um, but I think of tea like this is I'm the most comfortable in winter with my body because I'm hot pretty much year round when it's not winter. Uh, yes, yes. And for those who aren't on the the Zoom call, these two are making stupid gestures back and forth about how hot I am and ooh la la. Anyway, so no smartasses. I'm like literally physically hot during most of the year, and winter is like the one time where I feel comfortable in my skin, and like I don't need to peel the top layer off. And so like
I'm
this,
glad you're comfortable in your body and wearing all the layers you feel comfortable in.
yeah, yeah. So with regards to like my favorite drink for this time of year, I mean I drink coffee more or less year round. But mead and coffee are the two things I think of the most when it comes to this time of year. Snow?
Yeah, I think for me, um, this time of year generally makes me think about drinking more whiskey. I mean, I do drink coffee all year anyways. I guess I drink more chai rather than regular tea. Um, I don't think my wine intake really goes up. And then as kind of as far as food goes, um, it always makes me think of Stalin. That was something my dad used to bake. It was like the only thing he ever baked. Um, it's a good Christmassy kind of
Did I hear you
thing
right?
to
Did you say
eat.
Stalin?
Yeah, Stalin. It's like marzipan in like a cake roll type thing.
Okay, thank you.
Were you hearing like Stalin?
Yes.
You're just sitting there thinking, why is he eating the remnant of a Russian dictator?
I
I don't
mean,
understand.
eat the rich, I suppose, taken to its literal logical conclusion, but
No, 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 no. Eat the equally poor. Um, yeah, no, Stollen.
oh, okay.
Okay.
Oh, thanks.
It's all right. When you're that hot, I understand it's hard to think straight. Um, and then the other thing is, I have gotten into a tradition of if there isn't a big family gathering and someone making Christmas dinner, we will get Indian, and I will be eating curry on the 25th of December, and it will be wonderful.
That's cool.
So yeah. And then the other question we got from Brandon, which is somewhat more serious, so maybe I should have done these the other way around. But who are some winter-related deities or spirits that folks could have an easy time connecting with?
It's kind of like mushrooms. There's some gods you can connect with just great during this time of year. Once. Uh, yeah, if you want to just go out and scream at the wild hunt and say, "Come get me, motherfuckers." I mean, that's one way to do it. You know? Uh, Scothia immediately comes to mind. I know you mentioned her earlier. I definitely connect this time with ice itself, with Ymir, but also Yokel, Snare, and Frosty, which are different aspects of winter. Yokel being icicle, Frosty being frost, and Snare being snow.
I would say a few of them that I think of are some like hearth and home deities, like Hestia and Frigg, because I associate winter with being in the home more. Um, from the pack tradition, I would say hunt, pray, and howl, as well as pack. Um, gods of fire, gods of the home, gods of community are all, I think, viable options at this time of year. Um, local land spirits, it might be a different feel going out in the winter as opposed to the other seasons. But I really enjoy connecting. Um, I think in some ways the communication can be a little clearer because there's less other things going on. Um, so, Sarenth, you do a lot of work with trolls. Would you say?
Would I say they're more active or like easier to talk with them?
Right. Well, more active or just as active?
I think that's got something to do with like how you are wired to process during winter because I find it way easier to hear spirits during winter, assuming they're awake.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely feel like the trolls are active year round. I find winter is so much clearer because there's not a lot of movement and noise, and I don't have as many distractions because I'm not getting bit to shit by bugs.
Oh, yeah. I also, this is just a random thought. Um, like in my understanding and in my practice, water helps to amplify like communication with spirits. And so, particularly if there's snow on the ground, I know it's snow as opposed to like liquid water, but I feel like it's almost a different way for that amplification to happen.
You hear,
That's just some
oh,
random
you
thought.
hear that snow? You're an amplification.
I mean, amplification.
It's
Oh, just so loud.
just like hooking up an amp. Wow.
So, Snow, do you have any spirits, gods and spirits to add?
Trying to think of ones that haven't been said. I mean, I think it is a good time of year to look into local folklore because there's always something to do with winter in the region, whether it's customs and practices or whether you can find a myth or a legend or some sort of tale. And that can often be interesting and then lead you to kind of new discoveries and new appreciations of where you're living. Um, or even just fun stories if you're not going to interact with kind of the beings within. Um, it often makes me think a lot of Slavic folklore as well this time of year.
Mm.
I don't have any kind of Slavic connection myself. I mean, I've had Polish friends, but um, and I don't worship any of those kinds of deities and stuff. But this time of year often makes me think of those kinds of tales because they do often just feature kind of snow and forest beings and things. You kind of get the usual Frau Holle, Frau Perkta kind of stories people talk of, and the aforementioned Skadi, and Chalach, um, and sort of different beings there. Yeah.
I wonder if modern heathens have tried connecting with the Yule lads or any kind of spirits like that. I I find their stories really entertaining and interesting, but I mean, they're also like mischievous shits, so I understand if people don't want to deal with that during this time of year.
Mm.
Um, but one of the other gods that really comes to mind is like, maybe it's not a different god, but maybe it's a god we already know. Like in my case, like I connect this time of year with Oski and Yolnir, which are two of Odin's Heti. And so um it may not be that I'm connecting with different gods. It might just be I'm connecting with them in a different facet or a different way or a
Mm.
Heti. And for me, like that's kind of where I'm connecting with Othin at this time of year is Oski the Wish Giver, Yolnir, Yule Father, Yule Father, that kind of thing. But I feel Scathi especially strong during this period of time. But I'm also just it's different aspects of the land spirits too. Like I think we're in pretty consistent communication with the Lanvatir around here, and it's just really mm, some of them are like, I'm hibernating, leave me the fuck alone. Others are like, some of these Lanvatir are waking up and won't talk to you during the warm times because this is their time. Um, I don't know about y'all, but I tend to find elves less desiring to wander about until the warmer climes come through.
Mm.
But the trolls are like, fuck it, we're walking around all the time. Many of the Jotnar, same deal. Some of the Jotnar I connect more readily with during this time, just because it's so I feel like I get more interference, like I said earlier, like between the bug bites and the heat and everything else. I find it a little harder to focus sometimes in the warmer months, and my clarity is much more. It's much easier to not be distracted. So it might just be a me thing, but I tend to find there's a number of spirits that are more readily accessible to me at this point in time.
I think one thing there is that if you look to a lot of the mythology and a lot of folklore where there is sort of a harsh, snowy, cold winter, a
Ooh,
lot of the beings and spirits out there are often ones to avoid or to steer clear of, which would then emphasize Emily mentioning kind of Hestia and Wester and those kinds of hearth and home spirits and deities who may be good to turn to and leave offerings to or say prayers to and so on
oh for
during
sure.
this time and kind of shift that focus towards hearth and home and family and kin and being thankful for stores of adequate food and the heating working and those kinds of things, um, as much as for kind of protection from whatever may be happening out there. And also another thing that I think is perhaps under discussed generally, and maybe this could be a topic for another episode to some degree or another, is often when people look to kind of gods of times of year or gods and spirits of different holidays, it's that kind of idea of, are you forming a relationship, in which case you're neglecting that for the next 364 days? Or are you very much aware of the fact that this is a kind of seasonal thing and treating it as such? And this is just kind of the as and when occasional thing, and just kind of having that sort of consideration with whatever you do during this sort of time of year.
Yeah, that's an important thing, I think, to think about. Being in the home, I think ancestors too are like, I think connecting with your ancestors is great any time of year, but I think as just another type of spirits that you might have an easy time to connecting to in the winter, ancestors and like house spirits would fall in there as well. Um, I personally don't think of hell as winter specific, but I could see um, why people might associate her with the winter time specifically as just another deity that you might have an easier time to connect with at this time of year. It is interesting. I've known people that have formed relationships with deities at other points of year, only to later find that there's like a specific time of year that they really connect with that deity. And then the rest of the time, that deity kind of takes a backseat. And it's interesting to me when it's like a seasonal thing. I have gods and spirits come in and come out, but I don't know if there are many, if any, that I have like very sharp seasonal divides on, though I have many friends that do. I don't know if I have like those types of relationships, but I do find it a really interesting concept. Um, like with the idea of Persephone coming up in the spring and then going down in the fall and winter and that kind of thing. Um, yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Snow, because you're like that person that I think of when it comes to, um, have you developed a relationship with this god? Are you just using them for this particular solstice? Maybe you should rethink that because these are gods. And yeah, I just, when it comes to that kind of boilerplate, I immediately think of you and all the times I've seen you deploy it on Skith Blathnir and various other forums. And I agree with it because it's like, but I also understand the impetus to I want to connect with this god during this cold time where I can feel them much more clearly. Um, so I kind of get it from both perspectives because there's people just connect when they connect. Um,
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with only offering to Mercury when you're going to travel.
right,
That's fine.
right.
But also, there's nothing. Also, you could gain and benefit from a long-term ongoing relationship with Mercury as well.
Mhm.
And it's just considering which of those kind of routes you're going with.
Yeah, it's something that when people are like, "Oh, what is a god good for?" Like everything. Like especially when you're talking about gods that you develop long-term relationships with, that god can kind of insert themselves into literally everything. Yeah, Hestia might be known as the hearth goddess, but she's also the one that's going to see you home safely again if you have that relationship with her. Um, I'm kind of like Emily with that because I don't have gods that I can immediately think of that come to mind that I only connect with during like say winter or summer. I much more connect with certain Heti only during certain times of the year, like again, Yulnir or Yule Father. But also, there's certain aspects of Freyr that I connect with more readily during this time period versus like Freyr in the mound or Freyr under the mound feels much more around this time of year than, say, spring, where I feel like the resurrected vegetation god, the planted seed, that kind of thing is much more the vibe I get from Freyr versus right now, where it's just definitely like Tomb Freyr. Or Tomb Freyr. Um,
He's my favorite wrestler.
just imagining Freyr with a pair of pistols shooting a dinosaur. It's okay. Tomb Freyr.
Tomb Frey.
Now with DLC. Um,
He frays at tombs.
It's all dicks. It's dicks everywhere. But
Yeah, I mean, Emily mentioning Persephone made me think as well, because in the Gothic heathen group that I'm part of, we have similar with Saul, where, you know, at least in the northern hemisphere, the sun is absent during winter, and so Saul is traveling through the underworld, and we have sort of myths that we have about that, and sort of Garthed out leading the wild hunt, searching for her as his kind of taken love, um, and then kind of exacting his vengeance on those who may be holding her from him, and that kind of thing. But that doesn't mean that as devotees or worshippers, we can't also pray to Saul and worship Saul during this time of year as well. Sort of, we have myths about her being absent during this time of year, but that doesn't mean there is literally no sun around.
right.
And it doesn't mean that the powers of the deity are suddenly off limits and you know, switched off. Kind of, the gods are still gods, even if you have stories about them being in certain places at certain times.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we have stories all over the place about gods who die and come back from the dead, and or who are dead more or less year round. I mean that. Yeah, that tracks to me.
Mm.
Uh,
As the charity adverts may say, a dog is for life, not just for Christmas, but a god is for always,
and not just for Yuletide.
and not just for Yuletide, or not just for not Yuletide either, you know.
You know, I want one of our folks to make a meme for that. That's awesome. I love it.
On that note, do we have a show?
I think we've got a show.
I think we're all cracking.
If you're cold, they're cold. Bring them inside. Just leave the wild hunt out. Ah, so I really appreciate being able to sit down and enjoy each other's company during this final episode of season 6. And for all of our listeners, I really want to just extend warm wishes for you all in this holiday season, and thanks for joining us for yet another year. This has always been a joy to make, a joy to be part of. So I really am looking forward to next year because we already have some people lined up, and I'm excited. And we're going to be hitting the ground running, what, I think January the 11th after our little break.
Yeah, it's pretty quick, because we all turned to Sarenth and went, well, as the model of how rest works, we shall use this for the show. Yeah.
And this was not the first mistake, but it certainly wasn't the last.
And that's how 2025 is gonna go. But yes, for all of our listeners and for producer Jason and all our Patreon patrons, I hope everyone is as happy, healthy, and safe as they can be over this period with whatever you may or may not be doing and whatever you are doing or not doing.
Damn, we just covered all the bases there, didn't we?
Yeah. So, Emily, if people want to continue to cover their bases and find out what you're doing at your base, where can they go?
Eventually, I will publish something on streakingfate.wordpress.com. They can come and try to find me there.
And you can find my stuff at snowthegoth.com or find me at linktree/snowthegoth. Sarenth, where's your base at?
All your base are belong to us. Sarenth.wordpress.com is where you can find my blog. You can also, if you wish to patronize me, you can follow Snow's example, or you can follow me on patreon.com/Sarenth Odinson. And you can hire me to do rune readings or to write you poems for your gods, ancestors, or Vatir. And you can also support this show at patreon.com/AroundGrandfatherFire. We thank every one of our Patreon supporters for a wonderful year and a beautiful new year as we come to a close on this season 6. And thank you. I really appreciate everybody's efforts on this show. I really appreciate all of the work that goes into it. I know with everything we have going on that this is a mighty labor of love on all of our parts. I want to thank Emily and Snow and Jason for all of their hard work on this show. And I want to thank everybody who joins us around the fire each episode. Or if you're just a new listener this episode, welcome around the fire. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next year around the fire.